Picture ruling an island under a law that forbids alcohol completely. No exceptions, no loopholes. A faith that considered wine forbidden, enforced by a government that meant it. And now, picture that same island on the slopes of an active volcano where wine never actually stopped being made. For years under this rule, vineyards across Etna were torn out, burned. An industry that had already survived Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines looked, for the first time, like it might simply cease to exist. And yet, quietly, behind walls, in small plots that outsiders rarely saw, it didn't. How does an entire wine culture survive a government that considers it a sin? That answer is coming, but to understand it properly, we have to rewind. Past the sultans, past the silk merchants, all the way back to the empire that took Etna wine more seriously than anyone before them. The Greeks had given Etna structure, vertical vines, real cultivation, a system. The Romans, who took control of Catania in 263 BC, took that system and, true to form, pushed it further. Roman-era Etnians didn't just make one wine from a harvest, they made several, deliberately splitting the same grapes into entirely different products, graded by exactly how much pressure was used to extract the juice. At the top of that hierarchy was primo fiore, which translates to first flower. The very first juice to run free from the grapes before any pressing at all, released purely by the weight of the fruit on top of itself. No machinery, no force. Just gravity gently coaxing out the finest juice available. This was the aristocrat's wine. Then, at the other end of the scale, once every last drop had been pressed from the exhausted grapes, there was aquatina, a thin, low-alcohol wine water. This was the poor man's wine, mixed directly into drinking water because it helped keep the water safer to drink for longer. 2 wines, 2 social classes, 1 harvest. It's a strange thing to realize, the idea of grading wine by exactly how it was extracted, free-run juice prized above pressed juice, is a principle serious winemakers still swear by today. The Romans weren't just drinking wine on Etna, they were quietly inventing a hierarchy of quality that the wine world never really abandoned. Remarkably, aquatina is still being made on Etna today, albeit in small quantities. 2,000 years later, a Roman farmer's practical trick for stretching a harvest is still sitting in someone's glass. So, Rome refined what the Greeks started. But the next chapter of this story isn't about winemaking getting better. It's about wine nearly being erased entirely by the very people who were supposed to protect it. When the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, took control of the region in the 6th century, they brought something else along with it, a government monopoly on grain and silk. And that monopoly had a direct, brutal consequence for Etna's vineyards. To feed the silk industry, vines were torn out and replaced with mulberry trees, the only thing silkworms will eat. Wine didn't disappear completely, but something about its role in daily life changed. Under Roman rule, wine had become an economy, work for growers, artisans, sailors, merchants. Under Byzantine rule, and the growing influence of the church, bread and wine started becoming something else entirely, a religious rite, tied to the altar rather than the table. Wine moved from civilization to ceremony. And then, in 902 AD, everything changed again. Sicily fell to a mix of Berbers, Arabs, and Moors. For the first years of Muslim rule, the results for Etna's vineyards were about as bad as it gets. Vines were uprooted, fields were burned. An industry that had survived Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines were staring down the very real possibility of simply ending. You would expect that to be the end of the story, but it wasn't, because what happened next is one of the strangest, most overlooked chapters in the entire history of this mountain. Islamic law forbids alcohol, and yet Muslim rule in Sicily didn't manage to wipe out wine on Etna. Here's how. Sicily's new rulers allowed the dhimis, protected religious communities, specifically Christians and Jews, to maintain small vineyards for their own religious consumption. The wine had to stay behind closed doors, quiet, private, but it survived. A wine culture survived a government that considered it a sin because that same government made a narrow, practical exception for the people it ruled over, and Etna's winemakers made sure that exception never quite closed. And there's something genuinely fascinating buried in this period if you know where to look. Surah 47:15 of the Quran describes paradise as containing rivers of delicious wine. A civilization that didn't drink had still thought in extraordinary detail about what wine should be. It's been noted that there are more than 350 distinct Arabic words and phrases dedicated purely to describing wine. Mount Etna and the Islamic vision of paradise, it turns out, weren't so far apart. Rivers of wine flowing down a mountain that looked, to more than one visitor, like something out of scripture. The Muslim period on Etna eventually ended the way most conquests do, with another conquest. The Normans arrived, defeated Muslim rule in 1091, and allowed the construction of Christian monasteries around Catania and across Etna's southern slopes. And with those monasteries, the wine industry was rescued. Not for the first time on this mountain, and as we'll see across this series, not for the last. Empires and faiths had come and gone, and through all of it, wine on Etna kept finding a way to survive. But the next threat to this mountain's vineyards didn't come from an empire, or a religion, or an army. It came from the ground itself. Now here's a question worth asking. Why does the Etna DOC sit where it does? Why are these vineyards planted at this particular altitude on this particular stretch of slope? The answer isn't a modern regulatory decision. It isn't a committee that decided altitude was fashionable. It's earthquakes. On February 4th, 1169, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck the region. It triggered a tsunami, and almost immediately after, a volcanic eruption followed. 3 catastrophes, one after another, wiping out the eastern seaboard in a matter of hours. People had no choice but to move. Vineyards moved with them, up, away from the coast, higher onto the mountain. Then, in January 1693, it happened again. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake, followed by another tsunami. Mascali, at the time, the historical center of Etna wine production, was devastated. And each time disaster struck, the pattern repeated. People rebuilt further up the slope. Vineyards climbed a little higher than before. Twice, this mountain effectively told its own people, rebuild higher or don't rebuild at all. The Etna DOC exists at altitude today not because someone, centuries later, decided high-altitude wine was prestigious. It exists at altitude because the Earth, more than once, made the decision for them. Look at where Etna's vineyards sit today, and you're not just looking at a wine map. You're looking at a record of every disaster this mountain has ever survived, written into the landscape itself. So we had an empire that perfected the harvest, a faith that turned vines into mulberry trees, a conquest that nearly ended everything, saved by a handful of vineyards that were kept quietly behind closed doors, and an earth that twice physically forced the vineyards to climb higher. Rome, Byzantium, Islam, the Normans, and the ground itself. 5 completely different forces, and every single one of them left a permanent mark on how Etna wine is made and where it's grown. Wine on this mountain has never had the luxury of stability, and it was about to face something else entirely. An admiral, an emperor, and a war being fought thousands of kilometers away that would end up deciding the fate of the vineyards here more than any of them could have ever imagined.